name is Naomi Gale and I am a holistic pelvic health specialist and all-round doula birth keeper, and I want to speak to why you probably don't think you need a doula until you get to about 36-37 weeks pregnant. So I really want to speak to the importance of acknowledging that we live in a system that is perpetually pushing women into birth trauma. It is a system now that is built on the foundations of making money, pushing people into traumatic situations that basically avoid dead babies, is what they're saying, but actually these stillbirth rates are the same as they were pre-pushing all this medicalized system on them, and the trauma rates and the implications on baby are higher than ever. So what looks like a pregnancy that's swimming along in this glorious fashion will never be an issue. It won't be an issue until you get towards due date. It will become an issue because essentially the system wants you, bearing in mind that I'm utilizing the word the system wants you to be strapped down on a bed with an epidural and controlled. That's what the system wants. The system wants that anyway. The system wants that in a feminist, in this what we're saying is a feminist space, but actually what we're seeing is, you know, people being put on the pill from the beginning. What we're seeing is a lack of understanding in women's health in general. We don't see gynae obstetric training coming through with doctors. There is this real disconnect from what it means to be a woman overall, and the list goes on. But essentially what happens is that we are women who are perpetually told that our bodies cannot do what is essentially a physiological process, whether that's menstruate, or whether that's give birth. So if we have been in a society, which we all are, and we haven't been on some level of journey where we've learned that we cannot place all doctors on a pedestal, if we haven't been into that, we haven't had that initiation, so to speak, our trauma will exist within our pregnancy and there will be birth trauma. And even if you think that you've got this ability to speak up for yourself, you won't be the good girl mentality, you've got a partner with you, even if you think all of those things, I'm going to really, really sit here and say, if you're somebody that thinks they want to end up in the midwifery-led unit, or you really, really striving for a home birth, but there's still something around it, you know, you're not in that absolute fuck you system mentality, right? If there's any part of you that believes that the midwives or an obstetric person will be there and support you for your good, then you are potentially a prime candidate for birth trauma, even if you don't think you are. And I'm not sitting here saying that lightly. I'm sitting here saying that from what I see in my space as a holistic pelvic health specialist and from what I see in my space as the role of the doula and birth keeper. Your pregnancy can go along smoothly, swimmingly all the way until you get to 36-37 weeks. And things like this may crop up. Let me give some examples, such as, well, it might be great if you consider having a sweep to get things going. That's the start of a cascade. You will not have a physiological birth if you have a sweep. It's highly unlikely. There are the odd unicorn births that seem to break the mold, and I mean so odd, as in not odd, but as in the stats are very, very stacked against us to have those kind of births. So let's look at some stats around here. I like to just reel in the stats in case people think I'm talking around that, and I'm somebody that loves a stat. So my role as a doula is to signpost and to signpost the stats like the Cochrane reviews and those kind of things, right? So let's look at the stats. Stats are in QEQM, in Margate. Let's give some stats, right? Let's go to the March stats, because recently they haven't been sharing their stats because they're so bad that they don't want online Instagram influencers in the birth world to be pulling them up on them. That's the recent thing. We're struggling to find the stats. Maybe I'm wrong, but that was a couple of weeks ago we were struggling to find stats. I haven't looked recently. But a March stat, here's a really good one for March. So 11 births were in the MLU, in the midwifery-led unit, which is supposed to be a home from home, but is essentially a conveyor belt to the labour ward, because 11 births existed in the MLU out of 500 births in QE, you know, in the Thanet area, right? So 11 births existed in QEQM MLU, 500 births existed in East Kent, and then there were 2% of home births. So we're going to go into more of that, but essentially you won't need a doula to potentially until you're 36, 37 weeks. By then, you're going to get to a point where you need to start with the empowerment of what it means to give birth. And there's going to be a lot of like trying to get to that point. And it is doable. I've worked with somebody from 38 weeks. She ended up in the MLU and had a physiological birth. It is doable. I've also worked with someone from about 20 something weeks, and we've had to engage in a lot of prep, right? Because that's what was needed. So you'll know what you need, but essentially, if you end up lying there in the good girl mentality, then you will end up probably with some level of birth trauma, unless you have a spokesperson with you that's supporting you and signposting you and actively holding you in the feminine, as you always would have and should have. And more so than ever in a medicalized situation, which is perpetually a big business and forcing people into situations that make them more money. Essentially is where it stems down to. So if we look at why you would need a doula, you would need a doula who would ensure that you're aware of what the actual risks are that they're speaking to, because what they do is try and ensure that they get a woman in any which way, shape or form they can. So if you're a taller woman and you're measuring big, then you're not measuring big, you're measuring as you need to be. No one grows a baby that isn't the right size for them to give birth, right? This does not exist. It's not part of the physiological process, but they love reeling out the big baby lap. But wait, maybe there's I don't know, diabetes. Have you had the diabetes check? What, you mean the diabetes check that's technically not at the level it should be to ensure that we're really aware whether there's diabetes present in pregnancies, that actually the results are totally skewed? You mean that one that then puts someone at high risk? Oh, no, we haven't had that actually. Oh, yes, we have had that. You know, it's all of this kind of language. It's always negative. Midwives, unfortunately, are part of a system which is, you know, they have to cover themselves in a system that makes and ensures that women are strapped down to have babies. The labour ward is silent. The labour ward is silent. Why is the labour ward silent? It's eerie. The labour ward is silent because they're strapping women down. The stats for episiotomies, the stats for forceps, the stats for C-sections are getting higher, they're getting worse. The sweeps, the interventions, the drips, the language, the big baby chat, the small baby chat, the diabetes chat, they want to label you high risk. To have a home birth, you cannot be labelled high risk. To have a baby in the MLU, you cannot be high risk. You will be labelled high risk at the slightest thing, at the slightest concern. A doula is there to protect your bubble and protect your space. Because in order to protect your space, protect your bubble, you have to be informed. So the doula is there to inform you so that you can do that, right? The doula doesn't actively protect you. You make your own choices. You make your own way. You are the one navigating what you need. The doula is there to remind you of what you need. Ask anybody who's been through birth. Ask me. I've been through birth. I've been through birth of twins. I've been through birth of my son. When I look back, would I have a doula? 1000% would I have a doula. This is why I do what I do. I so wish, I look back at my birth and I'm like, I just so wish, every part of me wishes and dreams this moment of where I would have made that decision to have a home birth. No antenatal class, none of my NCT classes, no level of going through hypnobirthing. I will avoid what I went through, and what I went through is part and parcel of what most women are going through now, because you need to have somebody with you. You need to have somebody supporting you, empowering the masculine in the space if you have a partner, because unfortunately your partner is expected to do the job role that he is not, or they are not able to do, because they are there just wanting the safe delivery of their baby and the safety of you. And what the medical profession do often is not give you the true understanding of what it means that they're doing, what the implications of what they're doing actually means for your partner and the baby, because all they're doing is saying, well, do you want to risk the life of the partner and the baby? But actually, the stats for that will be so minimal that the stats that actually sometimes lying. They actually genuinely outright lie, and that is the truth of it. They lie around the stats because they're not giving you the proper stats for what it actually means. The implications of what they're doing mean. And second of all, they end up giving you something, let's say meconium, there's like poo present, and they say that the safer option would be to then cascade the birth. So that means intervention of the birth, right? So things like a sweep to try and speed it up, because we don't want the baby to be in the meconium for long, right? But the meconium, they're saying, is a sign of stress of the baby. But let's say the baby is 41 weeks. The baby's poo is probably a physiological process because at the end of the day, we all did a shit sometime, right? So the baby's meconium is not likely a sign of distress for the baby. It is likely a physiological process. We don't have the true understanding of why a baby might have a shit in labour, right? But what they will say is that you're risking the life of the baby through the baby inhaling their own shit, right? Okay, fair. That seems fair. That seems logical. And when you're there and they're saying that to you, that seems fair. That seems logical to you. And they're making that seem fair and logical, right? So then what happens is that they end up saying things like, if we give you a sweep, it will speed labour up. Baby lands earthside quicker, and therefore is less likely to is less time in their own shit, less likely to inhale it. All that makes sense. A sweep, then it might end up with you being on a drip, the hormone drip, to speed labour and contractions up. You then will probably have to have an epidural, because you cannot have the drip without an epidural. Then you have the epidural. I mean, it's very unlikely that that is the case because the pain is not normal. And then you would probably end up in a situation where they would start talking about forceps, if not already speaking about a C-section. Okay, so you end up in a cascade because they're trying to ensure the safety of you and the baby. What they're not telling you is that when they start that process, they are risking the baby inhaling their own shit more than leaving the baby for as long as it needs to have a physiological birth. The risks increase of the baby eating its own shit because they're perpetually putting it into distress. The syntocin drip puts the baby under distress. The heart rate often dips when they end up with the syntocin drip or an epidural. The sweep will put the baby under stress because it's forcing something along that shouldn't be forced along. And taking the baby out through C-section, forcepping the baby, will risk the baby's inhalation. Okay, they're not speaking to that. They're not speaking to that. What they're saying is to you as the mother, they're saying, well, we're trying to ensure that the baby doesn't eat its own shit. So we're going to make sure that the labour speeds up so that there's less time for the baby to do that. That's what they're saying, which makes sense. But when you look at what's actually going to happen, potentially they're risking the inhalation more. And then we can go deeper into the stats of what inhalation actually means to the baby, the risks of that. If the baby does end up inhaling their own meconium without intervention, what actually happens then? They don't speak to that either. So another good example of that is big baby, right? Shoulder dystocia. They'll go, your baby is measuring big. Okay, what's the risks of having a big baby, apart from obviously you going to, oh my God, my vagina's going to tear in half, which is never the case. The tears are a physiological process if there are tears, and often there's not if you're left with a physiological birth. And sometimes there's just a really low level tear that doesn't really need tending to, right? And I could go into tear chat. But the thing is, right, is that they're saying that there's going to be shoulder dystocia. Well, if we looked at the real stats for shoulder dystocia, then actually what we see, and so they're saying that we should induce birth to avoid the baby growing any bigger, to avoid shoulder dystocia. Now, if we looked at the stats around the implications of inducing labour, there is actually more of an issue to induce labour than there is to allow the baby to grow to the size it needs to be. And there's so much more around that, and we could reel off all the stats. I've got them all on what actually happens as a result of inducing labour versus allowing the baby to grow to the size that it needs to, and why the baby needs to get to the size that it needs to above all else, because the baby needs to sustain birth. The baby needs to sustain birth. You're going through 40 marathons, so is the baby. A baby needs to sustain birth, and a baby needs to be able to sustain itself for the first few days earthside, while the baby has to work harder to get that beautiful golden milk, and knows that the milk takes a few days to come in, right? So a beautiful, big, full-term baby is what we want. Like, that is what we want, because we want a baby to be healthy, and we want a baby to be grown, cooked, baked. You know, we don't want, we want the chick to hatch from the egg when it's ready. I grew up on a farm. There was incubation of eggs, right? There is a time when we learned the hard way that there was an egg and there was a chick in the egg, right? And the chick looked like it needed help. It looked like it needed help in order to get out of the egg, right? And there was a couple of times where this happened and we learned the hard way. So first of all, you don't start breaking open the egg. No one breaks open the egg before the egg is ready to hatch, right? Because the chick has to get to the point where the chick is strong enough to withstand getting out the egg. A couple of times we helped a chick to get out the egg where we thought in our human mind that the chick was stuck. So we started like helping at the shell, and then what happened was that chick was unable to walk. Because part and parcel of getting out the shell is being able to use their legs to push out, to gain the strength that they need, to build up the strength, build up that resilience, so that when they get earthside out of the egg, they can walk. So if we help them, then they weren't able to move. So I also grew up on a farm with sheep and cattle. There was the odd time where I had my hand inside a sheep. It was so rare. We would have flocks of 500 sheep, and out of 500 sheep in a year, you might end up helping like 5 to 10 sheep that needed actual help, where my hand was inside to pull the leg, to make sure that the leg was forward so that the lamb could come out, right? That's what the medical profession are there for. But we don't find ourselves in that space. That's like me helping every chick, every sheep to give birth. That is not the case, right? And that is what's happening. So you don't need a doula. Sure, you don't need a doula until you get to the end where they start getting antsy, where you go to a midwife appointment and they measure you and they start asking you about induction. They now formally have to ask you to have a sweep from 37 weeks-ish. Formally, they ask you for a sweep. Now, a sweep might be presented in any way it's presented, depends on the midwife. And the midwife isn't telling you the risks of having a sweep. Necessarily, the midwife just saying, yeah, just to help things along. It's part of a cascade. You will end up without a physiological birth, likely because of that. And it's exceptionally painful and it's totally pointless. It doesn't do anything. So the parcel of this whole thing is that they are under pressure from the system. The system is making more and more money from birth to ensure that a woman comes in, is strapped down, taking drugs, having an epidural, whatever it might be, and maybe ending in a C-section, making the hospital and everyone else more money. And that is essentially the system they're in. So if a partner asks me, well, what's the point of doing that? Why would they do that? Why would they treat a woman like that? Well, that is a system that unfortunately that we exist in, and it's sick. Of course it is, but it is part of the system. And you only have to go to pages very, very quickly, like, I don't know, an Instagram page like Kemi Johnson to see what's going on. She speaks to it in a similar way. And you only have to then look at your NCT groups or your antenatal groups or speak to your friends. And I'd love to hear how many positive birth experiences that you are surrounded by to make you believe and empowered in the space that birth is a physiological process, that birth can happen spontaneously, and that you are able to land on that feather bed of motherhood. And that unfortunately is ripped from most mothers. And the role of the doula, and my role as a doula, is to ensure that we do all that we can in a system that we're in and in the way that we feel ready for, and what is meant, but to land on that feather bed of motherhood. And that is why I am an antenatal birth and postpartum doula, because it's the postpartum that is also the most important and the most incredible part of this process. So if you're somebody that's like thinking about it, on the verge of thinking about it, or you think you don't need a doula, let's have a chat. We'll have a little cuppa, we'll see where we're at, and then we can go from there. Because at the very least, the acknowledgement that the postpartum is the most important part of this, as well as the birth, is being missed and is part of the conversation. But I'm telling you that you don't think you need a doula until you get to about 36 weeks, and then you still might not think you need a doula, but when you're strapped down and you look back at your birth, you'll probably wish that you did. And the costs involved of having a doula go out of the window when you understand what it means to have somebody on your side. Sending love.